I am a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center in Florence, Italy. And we would like to welcome you to our webinar on immigration and the US presidential election of 2020. We will start with short presentations by our speakers, and this will be followed by a Q&A session, in which you as our audience are more than welcome to participate and join. We encourage you to send your questions using the chat option at the bottom of your screen if you're using Zoom. We're also going to be monitoring the YouTube channel in case you also want to jump in through there. So today we have a great team of speakers, and I'm really excited and grateful to all of them for waking up so early and for joining us this afternoon. And we have Professor Cristina Leza, the Chair of Anthropology at Colorado College, Professor Gaspar Rivera Salgado from the University of California, Los Angeles Labor Center, and Dr. Andrew Selle is the president of the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. So thank you so much once again for being here today. We're really grateful, especially to Gaspar and Cristina for waking up so early, being here with us. So I guess I will start by explaining, giving us a bit of a background in terms of why this seminar is important. I don't think that we have to talk much about what is happening in the United States in this current context. The socio-political landscape, a few weeks ahead of the November election is nothing other than chaotic. There's demonstrations in the context of a series of murders that have involved African-American men and women, primarily by white police officers, the legitimization of the actions of the evangelical right and white supremacist groups by the White House, the virtual dismantling of the asylum system, the separation of families, and what appears to be at this point the indefinite closure of borders. There has also been terrifying reports of forced disappearances carried out against protesters by national security agencies. And of course, the potential for constitutional crisis should the US president decides not to accept a negative outcome to himself to the November election. So combine all of these factors have further polarized American society, an already divided nation. And of course, to this one must add the current pandemic and what this has generated, in the country. At this point, we're looking at over 210,000 people who have died, in the context of the pandemic, making the U.S. The country with the highest number of deaths related to COVID-19. While the challenges faced by the American people in anticipation of the election have been quite well communicated to global audiences, and they have also lacked a lot of complexity. They have framed the election race in this black and white binary, focusing primarily on white prejudice, which has left the conversation on structural and institutional racism virtually intact. In other words, the elections, the electoral discourse has been carried out at the expense of making invisible other critically important realities afflicting US communities. Furthermore, this simplistic coverage on race relations has reduced the struggle for racial and social justice to this black versus white debate. And this has made this long-standing challenges, but also the responses of marginalized but politically active communities across the United States quite invisible. More specifically, the political involvement of Native, border, and immigrant communities has been brushed aside, despite the essential and historical role that they have played at mobilizing voters ahead of the elections, but also resistance and engagement movements. And the goal that we have at the Migration Policy Center with this webinar is to bring to the forefront some of these conversations and some of these overlooked perspectives and scenarios. So our three great speakers, and growing from their long engagement within their communities as both observers but also as members, will provide insights into how migrant communities, how border communities, working class communities have organized and responded towards police brutality, immigration enforcement, surveillance controls. And they were also going to help us contextualize historically the struggles of Native American communities on the US-Mexico border to mobilize politically and defend their land. and also examine the ways in which election coverage has often privileged the coverage of some U.S. regions and dynamics over others. And this is, among many other topics. So welcome once again, Gaspar, Cristina, and Andrew for joining us. So without any further ado, what we will, mechanics or dynamics for the webinar would involve quick presentations by each one of our presenters. We are going to give Gaspar the first spot, given the fact that he's joining us all the way from Los Angeles. And following the 3 presentations, we will start having a conversation with our speakers and also with the audience. So Gaspar, go right ahead.
Thank you, Gabriela. Hello, Cristina, Andrew. It's great to be here. Good morning from Los Angeles. I'm going to share my screen because I want to project a PowerPoint presentation just to be able to put some issues on the table for discussion and debate during this conversation. And I'm going to focus mostly on the demographic revolution that the United States has experienced during the last 40 years with the increased arrival of Latin Americans to the United States. Basically, now Latinos are the largest racial and ethnic minority in the United States. And I think that this adds to the level of anxiety and issues about not only the elections, but the debate about immigration. Something that we have to put on the table at the start is that the immigration debate is part and parcel of the fabric, the political and social fabric of this country. I mean, the immigration debate has been taking place in the United States since the founding of the country. And it has taken long ways of nativist attitude, but also changing and fighting that attitude. We have to remember that in the late 1800s, the Chinese exclusion policy was the first major Native Act, and it carried all the way through the 20s with the National Origin Act of 1924. And then from 1924 to 1964, there was a period of low immigration. And then in 1965, that with the immigration reform under the Johnson administration, the floodgates open up and the origins of immigration switch from Europe to basically Asia and Latin America. And with this, we see that there is a very interesting convergence between the different ways of immigration and how important it is in immigration issues in public opinion. This is a graph that shows from 1993, the major peaks in terms of how public opinion states whether or not immigration is an important public issue that should be addressed by the elected officials. And especially since the Trump administration, these peaks have risen very frequently because we have experienced a resurgence of new arrivals, especially those arrivals coming from not only Mexico crossing the US-Mexican border, but also from Central America, especially those immigrants coming from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And this latest flow is as diverse as it has ever been, with thousands of Mayan Guatemalans coming here, mother and children coming from Honduras. So this has spiked definitely the debate, the political debate about this. And of course, we have an administration that is very active. And Gabriela mentioned some of those policies instituted. And I think in that sense, this comes the tail end of a very vigorous immigration debate that we have experienced, and especially since the early 2000s. Congress has been debating in the United States a compressing immigration reform. The country is divided politically, and they have been able to really arrive at a major policy that would overhaul the immigration system. One has to remember, for example, the Sensenbrennan bill at the end of 2005 that really pushed literally millions of immigrants, especially Latinos, onto the streets. This is the picture of May 1st march in Los Angeles. in the spring of 2006. And you can see literally the headlines is that immigrants have taken over the streets in many, many cities across the United States. So not only the immigration debate, whether or not immigration is good or it undermines this country, has been for us historically for a very long time, but I think the added um, context is that also immigrants themselves, members from the immigrant communities, have been very active in this political debate. So, but of course, the context that Gabriela is painting also complicates this debate. We have experiencing a reckoning with race and racism. And this is especially interesting because for a long time, the binomial racial relations, black and white, has been altered by the presence of immigrants. However, I think that we need to really start thinking about where Latinos and Hispanics fit into this debate. And I think it's the politics of race. Latinos and immigrants, actually the label that was created in the United States is ethno-linguistic label. It's not a racial label in the United States. And Latinos have to really choose where they're gonna fit, whether or not their future political fate is gonna be linked to the other racial minorities, such as the fate of African Americans, or um, like Latinos, Hispanics, for example, Cubans in Miami. I think they don't see themselves as racial minorities. So I think that that has to be part of this debate. Of course, the global pandemic, but also I think another very important thing, and again, one might think that immigration is a very important issue driving the political debate, but actually right now the number one issue is the economic crisis. All across all the groups, the most important thing that people want to elected officials to address is the tremendous negative economic impact of the global pandemic. We have unemployment rates that are unprecedented in the recent history of this country. And of course, just to be closing, the country is very divided. Um, in the last three presidential elections, and especially the last presidential election, it was extremely close. Actually, the night before the election, all major news media were calling the election for Hillary Clinton, and we woke up to the surprise that Donald Trump had won. So again, this election is going to be very divided, and one has to observe the behavior of immigrant communities themselves. And this is a projection of the population growth of the Latino Hispanic community in the United States. Right now, we have 19% of the population, 62.3 million residents of the United States are of Hispanic Latino origin. They have surpassed by far the African American population, and how they behave politically and how they're able to reframe the debate about race relations and immigration is going to be very important. But the challenge is that this community is very diverse. They come from all over Latin America. This Latino Hispanic population is not monolithic at all. Just in the Mexican case, we have the presence of indigenous Mexicans. Mexico is one of the most diverse countries in Latin America. 68 indigenous nations speaking their own language live in Mexico, and they're part also of the migration flow. So just because the Mexican presence is so huge, it's close to 78% of the Latino Hispanic population, they carry a lot of weight. So even this population of Mexican origin is very diverse ethnically and linguistically. So I think that just to put another issue on the table is that how we think about immigrants as political actors is going to be important. There's of course, different political projects currently in the United States trying to mobilize the Latino immigrant vote. Still, there is a sizable support for the Republican Party in some parts of the country. Latinos have not voted as a monolithic as African Americans for Democrats. So even some columnists are declaring that there's no such a thing as the Latino vote because this is so heterogeneous. So I think it's up for debate how these immigrant population, and especially their sons and daughters, the second and third generation, are going to behave politically is going to be very important for the outcome of not only this presidential election, but also for the outcome of other elections. And we have seen that, just to conclude, in California. We had this same immigration debate in the 1990s, and that had a tremendous political revolution in California. And this is a picture of the three most important figures in California. The governor, of course, this is Governor Brown, but the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, and the Senate, President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon, were two Latinos who were part of this new wave of elected officials who, had transformed the politics. They were signing a legislation increasing the minimum wage to $15 per hour, where in other parts of the United States, this issue hasn't moved. Elections have consequences in terms of specific policies that elected officials can move forward. And I think, if anything, maybe California might show us the path for the future. But I don't think everybody in the United States want to see their future as California. So I'm going to leave it here, and hopefully we engage in debate after my colleagues also have the opportunity to give us some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaspar, for your remarks. I think it's very much important, as you mentioned, to acknowledge the diversity within the label, of Latino, and how in a sense all of these labels at the same time are promoting, in a sense, the same level of structural violence that we get to witness, and also this systemic and systematic process of making specific groups invisible. I think in the case of California, we have seen this more how indigenous communities, not only in California, but also, for example, in New York, the growing visibility of the political, of indigenous communities, becoming even more involved politically. At the same time, recognizing that historically they have been, very much engaged in political struggles. But again, that there have been other forces at play that have hidden, their involvement. So thank you so much for bringing these points up. And next, when also connecting some of these issues to her conversation, we have Dr. Cristina Leza from Colorado College. So go right ahead. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon or good morning, I suppose, depending on where you're at. I also have a PowerPoint presentation to share. So I'll go ahead and get that started. Sorry, it went forward a bit. So I'll be talking just a bit about issues for Indigenous peoples on the US-Mexico border. I'll focus a lot on the Tohono O'odham Nation, but I have worked with organizations that are concerned about and represent several groups across the US-Mexico border. And on this map you see these different indigenous groups, which stretch from the east to the west, all across the US-Mexico border, with many Kickapoo groups being represented in more the eastern portion of the border. And then we have the Kumeyaay represented on the western portion. And then here on the map, you see the very large Tohono O'odham indigenous territories represented, along with other groups such as the Yaqui or Yome, the Kokopah, and Piman groups who are related to the O'odham or the Tohono O'odham Nation. The border currently divides the Yaqui or the indigenous territories and peoples of multiple indigenous groups, including the Yaqui, O'odham, Kokopah, Kumeyaay, Pai, Apache, and Kickapoo. peoples. Many members of these communities refer to the US-Mexico border as an imaginary line, since this was not a territorial border that was ever traditionally recognized by their communities. It's something that has been established fairly late in the history of Indigenous peoples' occupation, traditional occupation of the what are now known as the US-Mexico border region territories, and established by European and then later US and Mexican nation states. So they're seen as something that are constructed in nature, not immediately relevant, or at least relevant from a traditional perspective to Indigenous peoples. But the US-Mexico border, of course, has very real impacts on Indigenous peoples today, and these impacts include environmental, cultural, political, and economic, and psychological impacts. There are activist members of the Otham Nation who talk about the ways in which the US-Mexico border has served as a sort of form of psychological warfare against the Otham peoples because of the increasing militarization and presence of US border patrol. And then the psychological impacts are also present in simply the increasing desire to establish a border between Otham peoples who reside in the nation state of the United States and those who reside in Mexico. So seen as a way of separating this people from their members, and serving as a way of separating them as well from their traditional lands and their traditional resources. So the organization that I worked most closely with is the Alianza Indígena Sin Fronteras. You'll also hear them referred to in English as the Indigenous Alliance Without Borders. Their slogan is Somos una familia, no tenemos fronteras. We are one family, we have no borders. And this particular group includes members of the Tona Otham, Acoma Otham, Cocopah, Kickapoo, Lipan, Apache nations. Right now, I'm just going to show you just a bit of a video by two hip hop artists. They go by the name of Shining Soul. This particular video came out just following the passage of two Arizona laws, which are seen as highly discriminatory against Latinx communities. But a part of that, you saw the discrimination against Indigenous people. So there was this discrimination that you saw both against Latinx and Indigenous because of the inability to discriminate against brown-skinned or between brown-skinned peoples in the region, the tendency to not recognize the continued presence of Indigenous peoples, and there was a sense of solidarity building between Indigenous activists in the region and Latinx activists in the region around this shared discrimination against them as brown-skinned peoples. And so I'm just going to share just a bit of the clip. I won't play the whole video due to time, but this is to give you a sense of the messaging that we see emerging in the region.
Turn off your vehicle.
Why is that?
Because I'm asking you to turn it off.
Why is that?
Because we're gonna inspect your vehicle.
You can fucking check my vehicle all you want, but this is no right to do that. So
It's all right.
it's our land, not your land.
Up in the city, y'all know the deal. But back on my reservation, it's been the ordeal. Red light, blue light, keep still. Checking for ID, you get the ideal. Who your family be? Where your papers at? Don't it sound like a chop and screw track? Feds on my back taking photos. Border Patrol equals Gestapo, they out to get ya. I'm just minding my biz. Officer tripping like a Lambie. Here's pop quiz. How did we let it get this far? Spy drones got me on radar. Star Trek lights at night, minus Picard, all up in my backyard. Fuck the National Guard and the Frontierer. We under attack. Time to do it like Pia Machu and fight back. It's like that. Click clack, where your papers at? We under attack, fight back. It's war.
Click clack, where your papers at? We under attack, fight back. It's war.
Click clack, where your papers at? We under attack, fight back. It's war.
Click clack, where your papers at? We under attack, fight back. It's war.
So that was just to give you a sense of some of the protest that was developing around issues regarding the enforcement of the U.S.-Mexico border. The laws that I referred to a bit ago were first the elimination of ethnic studies in the state of Arizona in public schools, and then also a law which essentially legalized racial profiling by police officers to be able to stop individuals that they suspected as being non-documented immigrants to ask them for their papers or proof of their legal status in the United States. In that video, you also saw a reference to surveillance technology on the U.S.-Mexico border. So in the lines, I'm just minding my biz, officer tripping like a lamb, be his, pop quiz, how did we let it get this far? Spy drones got me on radar, Star Trek lights at night, minus Picard, all up in my backyard. This particular line certainly references the presence of Border Patrol on Tohono Nation lands. It refers to police persistently stopping Indigenous peoples on their own territory to ask them what they're doing there and to ask them for the proof that they are citizens both of the United States and also of the nation. And then the reference to spy drones refers to the heightened surveillance technology. And this includes surveillance towers that have been constructed, as well as a variety of other types of technologies that have been developed to monitor movement on the Tohono nations. And we see this across the US-Mexico border as well. So there are several international articles that protect, specifically through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that should protect Indigenous peoples' rights on their own territories. This includes the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures. This seems to be a broad article that does not directly relate to the US-Mexico border, but my work has shown with the different Indigenous groups there and different members who are concerned about their ability to maintain and revitalize their traditions, that the connection across the border is really important. They need to be able to make use of their members as well as their lands as resources that they can use in order to continue to revitalize their communities. Article 36 of the Declaration very specifically refers to Indigenous peoples divided by international borders to be able to maintain all of those significant contacts across the US-Mexico border in order to maintain the social and cultural integrity of their communities. Now, there are some protections for Indigenous peoples in the United States. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, which was established shortly after 9/11, did take into account the special position of Indigenous peoples, both on the northern and southern borders of the United States in terms of their need to maintain connections to their relatives on the other side of the border. And so the U.S. has still recognized and worked with the Mexican government to maintain special permissions for Indigenous peoples to be able to bring over members across from Mexico across into the United States for ceremonial and social events. The process involves what's referred to as a letter of invitation from U.S. Nation, Indigenous nations to Indigenous members in their related Mexican communities. These are referred to as paroled entries, however, which many activists, Indigenous activists take offense to, in the sense that the relatives who are being brought into the United States crossing their own traditional territories are considered to be like criminals or recently paroled criminals who are being held under suspect in terms of whether or not they will choose to remain illegally in the United States. And so there are these special understandings that are put in place where U.S. members of these nations are required to be responsible for these community members who are held to be suspect until they go back to their home communities. In addition to letters of invitation, this process that allows members to come over from Mexico into the United States for special events. We also have enhanced tribal identification cards that have been developed. This was a mandate of the United States that basically required Indigenous nations to change their identification cards to be more like passports. It has the enhanced technology that allows the Border Patrol agents to verify U.S. citizenship, as well as Indigenous nation citizenship. And although there are many Indigenous community members who don't think that this is something that their nations should be required to do, that this has been something that many Indigenous nations have taken advantage of in order to ease the ability of their members to cross back and forth across the border. This is, however, something that is only available to members in the United States. This is not available to members in Mexico. This is only to make it easier for members in the United States to be able to recross and come back into the US after making a visit into Mexico.
Sorry.
Now, while there are these
If we-
protections in place, we do have the Real ID Act of 2005 with an amendment to ARERA, which waives laws necessary to ensure the expeditious construction of certain barriers and roads at the U.S.-Mexico border. And this essentially allows the waiving of, sorry. I know I'm running low on time, so I'll try to rush a bit here. That waives any laws that to therefore allow for the construction of these border barriers. And this allows also the waiving of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So we have seen border wall construction certainly over an extensive period of time, but also more recently with the Trump administration, border construction in areas that are considered to be sacred to the Atham peoples in Arizona and Mexico, such as Oregon Pipe National Park, Monument Hill area specifically, where we have some burial sites. And we also have seen in the Quito Bequito Springs area, the border wall construction, which is affecting the water table, which feeds access into Atham communities and is also considered to be a very important site for Indigenous peoples. And this, there's also the issue of how Border Patrol agents search items. So this is just an image of a yaqui deer head. There was one incident where a yaqui deer head was seized. A yaqui deer head is not supposed to be handled by anyone but a yaqui deer dancer. But that was not respected by Border Patrol agents. And so when the deer dancer did not allow the deer head to be inspected, it was torn apart, and which was considered to be obviously a very negative event, and some interpreted as a bad omen for the ceremonies. There has been an uprising since the election of Trump, and the Trump administration's movement to construct more border barriers on O'odham territories from O'odham groups specifically. So we have Indivisible Tohono, which rose and has been very active in protests, and we have also the development of the Tribal Border Alliance, and this is a joint alliance between the Tohono O'odham Nation, the Pasco Yaqui Nation, and the National Congress of American Indians, but also invites nations from around the world with border issues to talk about their joint concerns. And at the Border Alliance, the first Border Alliance meeting, there was a proposal that was put together to help better recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples on the U.S.-Mexico border. And so to conclude,
sorry to interrupt, but we really need to wrap up.
Oh, no, yes, and I'm concluding. Yes, sorry about that. These are just some possible avenues for additional rights recognition, some of which have been talked about in the proposal. Okay, yes, I am done now. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry that we have to cut it short, but I'm sure that we will have, we can expand during the discussion section. And what you actually spoke about reminded me of a conversation that I was having with some border scholars last week, several of us who grew up along the US-Mexico border, and how when we were talking about this frustration that we get that when we are invited to events, to webinars, we're always pretty much asked the same questions, like how we feel about the wall and what we think about the violence on the border. And whenever we try to bring, into the conversation, this more specific activities, the surveillance, the invasion of privacy, the very violence that people experience in their coming and going, along border communities or across the border, are really not that explored. So thank you so much for bringing them into the conversation. And next, we go with, of course, Andrew, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Go right ahead.
Well, good morning, good afternoon for those in Europe. Good morning for those on this side of in the Americas. Great to be with you, Gabriela. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Christina, that was absolutely fascinating. I've already opened up Shining Soul, by the way, on iTunes here, and I usually do musical recommendations to our staff team on Monday, so I'm pretty sure they will be part of that. Actually, that was great, and it was really fascinating to hear your presentation. And Gaspar, my friend of many years and collaborator, great to be with you. I'm afraid I'm going to take this back in a more boring direction to talk about the election, so I'm going to go back to where Gaspar was, but I'll try and come back to what Christina talked about just at the end to say what implications does this election potentially have for the border, because I think there's a lot of implications that this potentially has. First of all, let me say we are having an election in a most unusual time in the United States, and there are at least two things that make this deeply unusual. The first time is the real breakdown on consensus around democracy. We in the United States have always thought of ourselves as an imperfect democracy, but a deep democracy. We've been doing this for over 200 years. We believe in elections. We can disagree about many things, but we believe in the process. But that is not true at this moment. And it's not been true at other moments in history. And it's certainly not been true because there have been huge groups of the population excluded from voting in the history of the United States. So this is not our first debate about whether, we are a truly democratic society. But this is a debate now coming from people who believe that elections are being manipulated. It's no longer primarily the distrust of elections has come from the exclusion of groups of people who felt that their voice was not being heard, or de facto did not have their voice heard, that they were not able to vote at the polling. But we're not now having it from a much more diffuse force, and oddly enough, it's coming from the presidency of the United States. Usually, it is opposition groups that tell you that the elections are rigged. This is an election where the person in power is actually telling us that the elections are rigged, and that's an unusual. I won't say any more than that. Just to say that's unusual. We can talk about that more in Q&A if you want, but that is an unusual place to be. It does speak to the fact that we're a federal system, that many of that the president doesn't in fact control the levers of the electoral system, but it is still an unusual thing. That is usually what you hear from an insurgent candidacy, not from an incumbent candidacy. The second thing going on is obviously this is happening, but it also has consequences in the future, whether people accept the result. Let me just say that whether people accept the result, the degree of margin of maneuver that a future president has may or may not be influenced by this, right? And this did not just happen with Trump. I mean, there were 20% of the population, 20 to 25% of the population, depending on the poll you looked at, that believed that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and eligible to be president. So this question of this sort of diffuse, almost conspiracy theorist sense that our democracy is broken by unseen forces has been hovering out there before. Trump did not create it. Okay, it's been hovering out there. He's leveraged it. And whether that is because he believes that the elections are rigged or it is politically useful, it's interesting. There's a continuity here. So just let me put that up. That's unusual in this moment and could have effects down the road. The second thing is obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic that has shut down large parts of our economy, has shut down mobility. It has huge impacts on both the debate around politics going forward and policy going forward, but it also has really tangible effects on who votes. Because this will be the first election where it's likely that a majority of people or a significant minority will not actually vote in a polling booth. And again, this isn't new, and there's nothing wrong with this. In fact, we've been moving towards the notion of voting early as a way of giving people greater flexibility so that they can vote, right? I mean, this has been, the notion has been this allows people to be able to vote in the way that's easiest for them, right? We've always had absentee voting in the United States. I had to vote one year because I was out of the country. And so I remember with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, we sat down and actually, who was a Mexican citizen at the time, we sat down and filled out the ballot actually, and I voted, but she got to actually, we were commenting back and forth and doing, this was sort of fun. One of our early memories actually is, before marriage was being able to sit down and look at a US ballot and go through it. And voted absentee, right? And then headed into, and then, it was counted. But we've been moving towards greater flexibility. What's different this year is that there's a degree of constraint involved, which is for many people, particularly for older people in vulnerable populations, they're hugely worried about going to polling booths, right? And it's a legitimate concern. That is a gathering of people where you can contract COVID-19. What we don't know is who's going to vote early, who's going to go to the polling booths. Are some vulnerable populations going to do neither? Because they're also maybe the populations that are least likely to vote early, right? Maybe English, have lesser English skills, maybe less comfortable with the trying to figure out how to get your paper ballot ahead of time, because you often have to request this and then return it. I mean, it's a bureaucratic process. We don't know how this is going to influence the elections. And it obviously puts a premium on who is the most mobilized, in a way that has always been true, but is accentuated by the current moment. So let me just put those out. This is an unusual moment, at least for those two reasons. Also because we're in the middle of an economic crisis, but that's happened more often, right? I mean, that has certainly happened more often. One of the things that is interesting, since, this is MPC and I assume part of our audience is Europe, I would say if we had a system like much of Europe, Donald Trump would have been the Marine Le Pen of the United States, or the Kierkegaard, I think it is, the Danish People's Party, or the National Front in France, or the Democracy Party of Sweden. We would have had a very large second or third party that was populist, immensely skeptical of immigration, also skeptical of trade, somewhat pro, not fiscally conservative, actually somewhat fiscally expansive. Which these parties are, right? I mean, the National Front, the Danish People's Party, or the Democracy Party, it's this unusual combination of deep skepticism towards the outside world, but also sees a role for the state. And that would have been Trump. He would have been, a powerful voice. But we have a two-party vote, but a marginal candidate that others would have to figure out whether to work with or not. But he actually, in a two-party system, took over the Republican Party, quite successfully. And he created in 2016 a marriage between traditional Republican voters who are themselves a mixture of two groups. I mean, and any political party has many groups. They're not a single group, but there's sort of two major streams. One is fiscally conservative and the other is socially conservative in the terms we talk about. A socially conservative, often tied to evangelical churches or the Catholic Church or conservative Catholicism, concerned about the government's role on social issues like abortion, equal marriage, issues that are more social and cultural in nature, and a sector that is much more concerned around fiscal conservatism, around a smaller government, less active in society, and less expansive, lower taxes, so on. No, and those are not, they're, over time you get people who sort of overlap in those, but they really are different motivations, right? And that party, you added that Donald Trump, who activated a bit of both of those buttons. He talked about being a businessman. He won over some economic conservatives. He allied himself with social conservatives, though he himself, there isn't much evidence that he was that earlier in his life. But he also activated other buttons about returning America to a mythical past, right? I mean, Make America Great Again is about returning, and for different people that meant different things. It meant a time of higher employment, a time where working class jobs paid more. For other people, it meant a time where America was whiter, right? Particularly for some white voters, right? I mean, there was, where the notion or the social hierarchy among different racial ethnic groups was more clearly ensconced, which is say, turn back the clock. I was trying to avoid the saying, that it was a openly racist discourse, because I think he whistled to many people in many ways. He was willing to whistle to people with openly racist feelings about the way the country had become more integrated, and American culture particularly had become much more pluriethnic and pluriracial and much more inclusive, and we had an African-American president. But he was also whistling to lots of other groups in different ways, and whether that was pragmatic, whether it was deeply seated, not a psychologist, have no way of knowing, but he's whistling to economic conservatives about taxes. He was whistling to social conservatives about appointing judges who were socially conservative. There were lots of things. What is clear is that immigration, and being with the Migration Policy Institute, let me talk about immigration here. Immigration was actually central in 2016. Immigration was in many ways the dividing line that allowed him to take over the Republican Party and keep at least part of that base and mobilize his most active supporters. There's a group of active supporters. It's not clear that it's the issue that motivated most people that voted for Donald Trump, but for those people who often don't vote, who came out for him, who tended to be white working class, the issue of immigration, the skepticism about people coming from other countries to the United States, taking our jobs away, that became a huge, though evidence doesn't tell us that's true, but the perception that the people were taking jobs away was something that was actually motivating and allowed him to get that edge, not in the popular vote, but enough in the popular vote that he could win the Electoral College in the United States. And he's delivered on immigration issues. I mean, this is an administration that has taken a different public position on immigration than we've seen in recent history. I mean, we've seen every president, Republican and Democrat in recent history, talk about immigration as a motor of innovation and entrepreneurship in the United States, the fact that we are a plural country. You've seen different immigration policies. That's a different question. But from Reagan on, there has been a tendency to talk about the United States as an immigrant society, right? Now, obviously exclusive of Native Americans, I should say, with two colleagues here, who come from indigenous backgrounds, but also I would say tended to speak in general about this being a plural society, right? In a way that the United States is. It is ultimately a society made up of people who have either origins in the territory that is now the United States, original people, or have come from somewhere else, sometimes through force, sometimes by slavery, but have come to the United States from somewhere. And this is the United States is a created country for which you can appeal backwards. What is today United States is a conglomeration of people from all over. That has broken down in the past 4 years. That discourse of being an inclusive country that brings together people with different immigrant streams, a past in slavery, a past in indigenous and native peoples, that has broken down entirely, right? And we have seen a different discourse, and that's included a different discourse on immigration and where immigration fits in to the national narrative. And we've seen policies that have flowed from that. So policies primarily around protection, primarily around refugee quotas, primarily around asylum at the border, and Christina talked about the border, The asylum has been, shut down almost entirely at the U.S.-Mexico border at this point, and the refugee quota has been reduced to a level we've never seen before. So that's been the main thing. But we've also seen some inroads into slowing temporary migration, seasonal migration, particularly this year, as quotas were, there was a moratorium on a number of categories, including service workers, seasonal service workers, and high-skilled workers. We've seen a slowdown of some immigration processing. We saw yesterday new regulations for temporary high-skilled visas. And we have seen with the public charge rule, I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A, now a test, essentially a wealth test, about whether people will become a public charge if they're admitted into the United States. And that is also being extended to people who are requesting their relatives to come into the United States. And so that's a huge issue. And I'm sure it's also a huge issue also for Native communities at the border. I mean, this is a huge issue. Once you introduce a wealth test, what it does is sharply shift the pool of immigrants who are eligible to come into the United States. That may actually be the biggest change, in addition to asylum, maybe the biggest change on certainly the legal immigration scene we've seen. We don't know if it'll withstand court challenges yet, and we don't know yet how it'll remake immigration in the United States. And obviously, if there's a change in administration, it will almost certainly disappear, right? And will just never have had much effect. So there's a lot of questions on public charge. But if there's a second Trump administration, know that this is probably the one rule change that will vastly change who comes to the United States, even though they haven't been able to pass legislation. Okay, now we're in 2020. So let's get to back to this election again. This unusual election. Immigration is surprisingly not a big issue in this election. That judges, big issue. President Trump has nominated a Supreme Court judge, very important to certain social conservative groups. Taxes, economics, big issue. And Trump has a record on cutting taxes. People would say a mixed record perhaps on economic performance, but many voters are not blaming him for the economic crisis tied to COVID. So he comes out better on economics than he does on other issues. And that matters to fiscal conservatives. And I know fiscal conservatives who will vote for Trump, even though they don't like him, but they'll say, look, but I agree with his economic policies, and that's what matters to me. And he's doubling down on the cultural message. On this cultural message around no longer make America great again. Now it's keep America great. But this notion of a mythical past. But this time immigration is secondary in this, possibly because immigration numbers have gone down. And certainly in the middle of a pandemic, we're at the lowest mobility in modern history since World War II in the world. So immigration is not as sensitive an issue right at this moment. But there also Black Lives Matter. What it did was revive and bring front and center the larger question of racial justice in the United States. And Black Lives Matter has had an impact on talking about everything from Native people's rights to talking about immigration to talking about the inclusion of Latinos in American society. So it has been, but Black Lives Matter obviously first and foremost is also a question about disproportionate violence against African Americans in policing, right? Trump is now doubling down on a message that is more broadly about insecurity in cities. And that insecurity in cities, again, winks, sometimes more than winks, sometimes actually yells in the direction of people who are concerned about racial change in the United States, white, working class, occasionally college educated as well. And as Gaspar said, I'll come back to this in a second. Also for some groups, by the way, I mean, there are Latino groups who see themselves as more white than Latino as well. Latino individuals, I mean, right? I mean, race and ethnicity are concepts that are fluid in many ways. So we'll come back to that in a second. So he's winking, sometimes yelling. You saw him at the debate last week or 2 weeks ago now. Wow, things move fast here. Where he was asked to denounce white supremacist groups and he didn't. Now, maybe didn't understand the question. Maybe he did. Took him a couple days. He finally did, but took him a couple days there. He's trying to wiggle. He's trying not to scare off people that actually might vote for him for other reasons, like economic conservatism. And at the same time, he's trying to wink pretty heavily in the other direction here to a large subset of Americans, many of them overlapping with people that never believed that Obama was a U.S. citizen, for whom racial and ethnic change in the United States is a problem. Right? I mean, they see as, at the base of whatever they're living through in their lives. Where does this leave us? This leaves us with an election where anything can happen. the polls tell us, and with this I'll sort of move towards the end, Gabriella. I mean, the polls tell us that Biden is ahead as of today by somewhere between 8 and 9 points. That's a lot. If he's ahead between 8 and 9 points on November 3rd, he wins this election. There's no way that the difference between the popular vote and the electoral college can be that different, right? If he wins by 8, if he's not 8 or 9 in the end, depending who shows up, it turns out to be 6, he still wins. The electoral college is not, it's not going to vary that far from the popular vote. It can vary 2 to 3% for the popular vote, probably. That said, it matters who shows up, who votes early, who shows up at the polls. Mobilization matters a lot. There is some evidence that Trump voters are more motivated than Biden voters, although it depends how you ask the question, because there's also a lot of evidence that Biden voters aren't motivated by Biden, but they're motivated by Trump. So they're motivated against Trump. So it depends a lot who shows up. It depends what barriers are there for voting. It depends on legal strategies that people put up to make it hard for certain groups to vote. A lot of this is going to play out in the next few days, and I think this is a something that we need to monitor. In addition to looking at the polls, look at who's actually voting and who is not able to vote, or who finds it difficult to vote for a variety of reasons. I mean, this is going to make a huge difference as we head towards the end. And I think we should assume that groups are not monolithic. White working class people tend to favor Trump, but one side of my family come from a white working class family, and I would say there's enormous difference in that part of the family on who likes Trump and who doesn't. There are some people who really like Donald Trump in my extended family, and there's some people who really don't. White working class voters are actually divided on this. Now they lean towards Trump, but not there. Latino and African American voters and Asian American voters, by the way, who are large also, by the way, about 7% of the US population is Asian American, right? 6 to 7%. Large number, slightly lesser percentage in voters, but a large block is hugely varied as well. So, it turns out we're seeing particularly men, African American, Latino men, more supportive of Trump than women, which is interesting, right? Because some of Trump's message, his bravado, appeals to men more than women. There's a huge gender gap, also among whites, by the way, but it's become noticeable among African Americans and Latinos. We would say, no, Latinos are going to vote for Trump. Well, yes, they are, actually. Some of that has to do with identity and shifting identities, and some of it has to do with he's also appealing, yes, he's appealing to white working class, but he's also appealing to people for whom economics matters, to business people, to social conservatives, to men. He's got lots of ways of appealing. All to say that we are complex people. Our identities inform who we are, but they are not who we are exclusively. We all have multiple identities. And as people go into the voting booth, they are, they're white, they're working class, they're women, they are wealthy, poor, they're, many things. They're African American, women, men, voters in a certain urban, rural. I mean, people are many things all at once. And there's individuals. We're all quirky people. And so we don't exactly know how these socio-demographic characteristics, they give us tendencies, but they don't give us exact. We are not who we are on a piece of paper. We are who we are inside. And that is another layer of confusion here. That said, if I were voting today, if I were betting today, the safe bet is on Biden. But we know that Trump did this 4 years ago. He took over a political party and then he won a general election. And you should never discount his savvy ability to figure out politics in the United States. Final point, Gabriella, is I'm going to say, just because Christina raised this so well earlier, is there are two very different versions of the border playing out. And they have less to do, as I say to my friends in Mexico often, half the time we're talking about Mexico, we're not really talking about you. Half the time we are, by the way, but half the time we're not. The border is a symbol in many ways for Americans. Half the time when I say we, it's sort of the general we in the United States, but many of the debates about whether it's NAFTA or building a wall on the border or immigration from Mexico, of which there's very little, by the way, the number of Mexicans in the US keeps going down. All those things are less about Mexico than they are about an attitude towards the outside world, about a fear of the outside world on multiple dimensions. And so many things, Mexico has become a symbol in US politics because it's closer than the Middle East, it's closer than China. You can't really build a wall on the sea. There's no wall between here and Syria. I mean, that have very little to do with Mexico. And yes, there is some policy about Mexico, but a lot of this has very little to do with Mexico. The problem is real people live on the border. And so there is, in many ways, what you may see a result of this election have a huge impact on the border for symbolic reasons that have very little to do with Mexico, but will in fact have enormous impact on what happens in people's daily life at the border.
Exactly.
Thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your comments. And I think, I'll take what you were just mentioning, as part of, again, this constant questioning, right, over the wall. How 4 years ago the wall, was at the center of all of this discourse coming from the campaign, and how, I remember with several colleagues, again, just bringing this up, like every 4 years, that this is the same question, right? It's a never ending story in that sense. But then all of this everyday experiences of, being questioned. I remember, living in Arizona, being stopped several times, just to be, or I was working I was a county official at the time, and I still had to make sure that I looked like a county official so that I wasn't stopped. Or when carrying out research along the U.S.-Mexico border, same thing, that I wore, that my hair was, pulled up in a different fashion so that I wasn't questioned, or having to justify, my presence, which I think is something that, Christina in her, presentation started to talk about, how this is not only, again, it's not about the wall per se, the actual construction, but actually in the everyday lives of the people, who are along the border. So thank you so much for bringing this up. We are, of course, bringing this, going to open the conversation to the audience. But before we do that, I actually had a couple of questions that were related to trying to bring together these three presentations. Andrew, you mentioned this critical point: who is going to be able to vote and who is not. And this is, again, part of, this even larger question, which would be, what do communities expect? What are the challenges that you as speakers, and we will just go around, see, looking towards the election? What is at stake, for communities on the border, for Native American communities, for undocumented, or irregularized migrants who are actually quite active politically. What is at stake, for people. So I will go, I guess we'll go back to, we'll go in reverse. So if Andrew wants to go first.
Yeah, in the United States, only about half of people vote in national elections, a little over half, between 50 and 60%. It's quite low compared to some of the countries where I'm sure some of you are in the audience. And, that means it really matters who shows up, right? It really matters who shows up. What we saw 4 years ago, what we saw 12 years ago with Barack Obama is Barack Obama mobilized a coalition where African Americans and Latinos actually over-indexed in voting, right? I mean, actually came out in larger numbers than usual in voting, and generated a coalition of people, sort of, that the difference was not just, and he also did very well with traditional voting groups, but he also was able to mobilize people who often don't get to the polling booth in larger numbers. 4 years ago, we saw Donald Trump do something very similar, but with different groups, right? It was particularly whites without a college education who were concerned about changes in the United States, right? What they saw as changes that hadn't benefited them. And that group came out in larger numbers, and in particularly in certain states where it gave him the edge, in 3 states that gave him an edge in winning, right? What we don't know is what happens in this election. As near as we can tell, Biden does not have the same sort of draw that either Trump or Obama did. Biden is not a man of vision. He's a respected politician. He's a consensus builder. People like the guy, but he is not a visionary in the way that both Obama and Trump are. And I use the term visionary in a neutral term here. I don't mean to convey vision being in a good or bad way. Simply people who can communicate, a vision of where to go. Biden is a nuts and bolts guy. He's a nuts and bolts policy guy, right? And a consensus builder. the divide this time seems to be Trump himself, who's presented a particular vision of the future. We've seen 4 years of him implementing it, and whether people like that or not, and whether that is either motivating. And what we can tell so far is it's motivating some of that same base to come out 4 years later, though perhaps not as successfully as 4 years ago. It's hard to tell, because some of those people that were very excited are now facing unemployment in the middle of a COVID recession and so on. So he may have lost a little bit of that base, but we're also seeing that vision be incredibly polarizing to people who feel they've been left out of that vision, right? And so you may have a coalition that is not there because the opposing candidate has a bright, different vision, but because they don't like the vision that's being presented from the incumbent, from the president of the United States. And so I think the first thing is, who's motivated to vote, right? That's big question number one. Evidence seems to suggest that people who are anti-Trump are slightly more motivated right now than people who are pro-Trump. But again, polls could be wrong. Second thing is ease of voting, right? And different states, the US has a state-by-state system and even a county-by-county system on voting, right? There's certain things regulated at state level, certain things at a county level and city level in some places. So this is we're a very fragmented system in voting. Some places are easier to vote than others, right? In some governments that are worried about massive turnout, trying to make it harder for people to vote, trying to restrict the number of places you can drop off a ballot. There was some suspicion early on that even the federal postal system might be trying to make it harder for people to get to mail their ballots. I don't know if that's true or not. It's not my area of expertise, but it's certainly a public debate that you see in the newspapers, and so there's a huge question around that. And there's always the question in the United States about, how easy is it for someone to show up and vote? We've generally had a low bar for proving that you're registered to vote. You can show up, you don't have to show ID, because not everyone in the United States, particularly older people and poor people, do not always have an ID. But there are questions in different areas about what's going to be required in order to vote, and then how the votes are going to be counted as well. So I think all these questions are out there. If you were to ask me to guess, again, not as an expert in this, I would say this will probably happen in the end with fewer problems than we think. But there are lots of ways this could go wrong. And you may have a tapestry across the United States because it's so decentralized.
Thank you so much. Christina?
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see who actually turns out at the voting polls this year. I would agree, at least from what I have heard from communities, Indigenous community activists, both on the US-Mexico border, but also even locally here in Colorado Springs. A lot of the mobilization is certainly to have people go and vote. I would say that I would agree that the motivation to vote this year is less about voting for a candidate that they see being able to represent their particular needs and their particular movements, but to vote against Trump, who they see as clearly not representing Indigenous concerns or the rights of Indigenous peoples. I do, in my earlier research, I remember a particular statement from a Tohono Nation member, an activist, that has always stood out for me in talking about the problem of complacency within her community, that she felt that people didn't participate in the process because they didn't trust the process. They didn't participate in the election of tribal leadership or in elections locally, in the state, federally, just because they felt that their needs were never going to be represented and all candidates are essentially the same. And I think that's not just an issue, certainly within the Tohono Nation, but we also see that across the country as well. There is a lot of complacency when it comes to voting. And so I think a lot of the mobilization right now, even though there's definitely an anti-Trump sentiment, a lot of the messaging that I'm seeing is not let's vote against Trump, but rather just vote, just engage in the process, have your voice be heard through the voting process, and also trying to get information out, as much information as possible about how to engage in that process, to be informed and to make sure that you are following all the steps in order to make sure that your vote counts.
Thank you so much. Guess we'll move to Gaspar.
I think this issue about the ability to vote is very important. I think this is, we see a struggle nationally. And as Andrew mentioned, the United States is really a tapestry of not only state, but actually county level um, um, mechanisms of voting. And I think that the rule of the minority, we have minority governments who have been able to govern. I mean, this is the Southern strategy, right? Is to impede the ability of people to vote, because by depressing the vote, the minority can maintain power. And I think this is really interesting. That is not only the willingness, but the ability of voters to engage in the process. And I've been looking at the lesson in California, and this is also how thick are the networks within civil society. And I think that if you compare the engagement of poor, working, and minority people, it has to do with the ability of these people to voice their concerns, to shape the political discourse, to shape the political platform. When they see that, engagement reflects those aspirations, and that actually there are people engaging the multiplicity of communities in the form of organizations, advocacy organizations, nonprofit groups, unions, for example. And I think that that's what made the difference. California is not equal. So I've been doing work in large urban centers like Los Angeles and compare that to, for example, agricultural cities like Bakersfield. So you have within California the ability, for example, the Republican Party has control of Bakersfield County. The second in command in the Republican Party has been in office for 25 years, unchallenged there. The difference is the thickness of civil society, these advocacy organizations that have been able to channel, to support, and to expand the political debate. So in Los Angeles right now, the debate is not only about easiness to vote, but who should vote? How can we engage, for example, undocumented people in the school board of education elections? Parents who send their kids to school, despite the fact not having papers, they're affected by the decisions of the county board of education. So how can we engage? So we're really aspiring to be as inclusive as possible. Everybody's gonna vote by mail. I show the consequences of political mobilizations. Unions are the primary shaking movers in California, in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles. They have a massive get out the vote operation, for example. You have indigenous people, a native network of mobilizing the native vote, the Latino, Asian American, African American. So it's that level of engagement. Of course, not everybody is on the same political platform, but I think it makes a difference, not only to be willing as an individual, but to be able to have the infrastructure, the organizational capacity to do that. And I think that's where it makes a big difference. And that's where I think is the aspiration in places like the South. I think is going to be a test election, right? Whether or not the mobilizations, the Black Lives Matter movement, it can be transformed in this moment to a moment where people are engaged and sustaining the process, because that's the other thing, right? The usually local elections, if we think about presidential elections not having enough participation, just think about local elections that have a lot of consequences. The voting is even smaller. So I think that as you look at the United States, I think that it would be very important to look at local and state issues, because definitely it's playing out in very different ways. I mean, California, we've been in the forefront of the resistance, basically fighting the federal administration the last 3 years, right? And there's definitely an importance and a weight of Washington, the federal government, but I think this political moment is playing out in different places in different ways, and we need to pay attention to that diversity.
Thank you so much. There was, kind of turning to the questions, because I think this is very much related, and this comes from the director of the MPC, Andrew Geddes, and it's connected very much to this discussion that we just had. So there's, of course, this call for, there's a level of movement and an infrastructure that has historically, in a sense, been there. When it comes to the unions, for example, some of the campaigns, all of the civil society efforts. But there's Andrew was asking specifically about this suppression efforts. What are the, which in a sense are also historical, because we do know that there have been efforts, throughout American history to precisely to contain this at this level, the local, the more regional, ground-based efforts to get out and vote. So the specific question here would be, what is happening with the efforts to suppress vote and voters and the mobilization, of people? And here, I think I would add, just to the equation, the very fact that we are, as we all know, under a pandemic. So what is which is another one of the questions right here, how this efforts, which are very different, under this election, can be compromised or hampered, given the elements that that are in many ways being shaped by the discourse coming out of the White House. So we'll go with Gaspar.
I think that use the ability of people to go to vote. That's a process that I think many times is more fragile of what we think. I think that, and especially if we think about the current context, all of us, Christina, Andrew, and myself are describing an unusual, unprecedented context that put a lot of burden. I mean, there's, I've been interacting a lot with workers, blue-collar workers who work in the hotel industry, who are immigrants for 20 years, making it just above poverty level, and all of a sudden they lost their jobs. So the pandemic, just because you have to be quarantined, you lost your job, and there's no chances to get another job to replace the one that you had. I mean, people are really in survival mode. And I think that's kind of the fragility, right? There are other things that are competing for your attention. And I think that's where, how do you balance that? And I think it is clear that, President Trump was very clear about his marching orders. He's going to send his supporters to watch very carefully, the voting process. And that's, that's another threat. I think that the ability of people to negotiate that, whether or not how are you gonna confront somebody, a Trump supporter at the polls, asking immigrants whether or not, they have the right to vote, how they're gonna be able to navigate that. And I think, unfortunately, it's gonna be in those places where you have the capacity to mobilize supporters, the capacity to mobilize and be present and to persuade people to withstand that, they might be able to say, yes, I'm going to vote despite all the challenges that I'm confronted. But I think that's one of the main questions, given the fact that we're living in such unprecedented moments with so many crises, economic, health crisis. Is not, I mean, even the debates are shaped by this. I mean, we have a very unusual atmosphere. I think that is not a given. And I think the level of participation is going to be, I think, primordial here. And I think then we need to really, especially in California, I haven't followed other states, but there's a lot of consciously mobilization, people even calling to our neighboring states of Nevada, Arizona, people in unions preparing to go to the South, for example, to also to serve as a counterweight on the current threat. But I think the fragility of the ability to vote is there. And I think we are in an unprecedented context. And I think it's something that we worry about, and it's going to be important to watch.
Thank you so much. It's like this, how you first said, the fragility of the ability to vote, which is going to be critical for so many communities. Christina?
So I'll just say that I think that we are in a very interesting moment, and it's not, I think that the pandemic is definitely feeding into a sense of insecurity that the Trump administration has certainly been feeding on, and also in its efforts to undermine the process itself, undermine faith in the ability for people to engage in voting. I think that sends some interesting messages. First, I think there's a recognition there that there is a lack of faith to begin with in our system of voting in this country, that a lot of people don't think that their vote counts even in the best of circumstances due to the electoral system. And also it sends out, I think, a very clear message that the Trump administration and the Republican Party are aware that the more people vote, the less chance they have of winning, because they understand very clearly that the majority of the country do not support Republican values and Republican policies. And so there is that inherent messaging of fear that's coming from the administration itself about what it means to vote, and therefore the messaging in order to suppress the vote. I think one of the more interesting things that have happened as a result of the Trump administration, and perhaps because of the certainly the recent history of people being elected by the electoral college rather than being elected by the popular vote, has been discussions about whether or not we should be using the electoral system anymore. Should we be thinking in a different direction? Should we be restructuring our voting system so that we really do have candidates that are representing the majority of our population? I was quite surprised and disappointed when Trump elected that so much of our anger was directed at Trump as an individual. Although we tend to see that, we tend to see our anger directed towards individuals rather than at systemic problems. But I have been disappointed to not see more direct movement against the electoral system. But I think that regardless of who wins the election this year, regardless of who ends up getting elected into the various offices, including the office of president, I'm hoping that questioning of the electoral system and movement, hopefully away from the electoral system toward a system of a popular vote, is something that continues.
Thank you so much. Andrew.
Yeah, I'll be very quick on this. First of all, greetings to Andrew Geddes, and so glad to be at MPC, which is such an amazing organization. So we're huge fans at MPI of MPC, and love our ability to be able to go back and forth on issues that we both care about. So Andrew, great to see you, and admire your work. The only thing I'd add is just to what Gaspar said, which is, I don't know anything about voter suppression. It's just outside my area of expertise. I have a feeling that Christina and Gaspar know much more about that than I do. What I do see happening is life is just hard right now for a lot of people. And it's hard for all of us. I mean, the United States is, even more than many places in Europe where there was a partial reopening, depending where you are in Europe. In the United States, much of the US, we're still on sort of partial lockdowns. And that's hard for everyone, but it's not hard for everyone equally. Right. And, it's hard for me, but, I probably complained to my colleagues at work about this. I spent a big, chunk of a day last week trying to figure out, online assignments with my oldest daughter. It took a lot of work to do that, just to track sort of the assignments that are being given on multiple platforms. And the teachers are great. She goes to a great public school. She has great teachers. I mean, it's just confusing, right? It's just confusing to go online. But I started to think, she's, at a school with a lot of people whose parents are not native English speakers, right? For them, how do you figure this out? It's hard for me as a native English speaker. It's hard for me as someone who has some flexibility in my schedule to be able to take a couple hours off and sit down with her. What would it be like if I was trying to work a couple jobs in the middle of a pandemic and English wasn't my first language? What happens there? And I say that because then it comes to voting, right? And voting is kind of an extra thrown in there in life. And I really want to vote, but if I'm trying to figure out, on the scale of it, trying to bring an income for my family can eat, second, make sure my children are educated. And by the way, if you have 2 or 3 or 4 kids, who are in different grades, you're doing this multiple times over. Unfortunately, my other kids are too young to actually be getting real assignments. So they're in preschool. So, it's easier. But if you got 3 or 4 kids that you actually have to follow up, or 2 kids that are in different grades, that's your next priority. Voting comes somewhere in that 3rd category, right? It may actually come after making dinner. So it may be in the 4th category, right? I mean, life is hard right now for a lot of people, and it's hard unequally. It's hard for everyone, but it's harder for some people than others. And I don't know if that'll affect the election, because in the end, you can vote, in a couple hours. You can vote if you're voting by paper ballot. You can do it. So maybe it won't make a difference, but I can't help but think those who are having the hardest time in a hard time right now are facing an extra barrier to voting above what they normally would. And I don't know if that'll play out in some way. It certainly worries me as we head towards the election. And does that have an effect on our democracy?
Thank you so much. I think that is, a good point to actually drive into. Perhaps not this doomsday forecast. Wouldn't want to call it like that, but is there can we expect, I guess what I'm trying to ask is looking, towards the election and knowing, being aware of all of this concerns and this multiplicity of events, and the very fact that voting is probably, most likely voting is not at the top of people's priorities these days. What are we looking at? If you could, just, summarize or provide some sort of forecast, what do you think will happen? I think that, adding to that uncertainty that all of us share, but also, from your position, from your stance, what are we looking at? Also, kind of as a closing, commentary. Andrew.
I'll say that despite, having put out a pessimistic picture a minute ago, and the fact that there really are inequalities in how people are experiencing the current moment, I think the thing that balances this out is there is despite all the distrust on elections that has been thrown out there is an enormous resilience in American democracy. And in some ways, it is the inequalities that play out in American society sometimes play out at the ballot box, but not always. Sometimes, actually, people who have the least in American society surprise us by showing up in larger numbers than would be expected. Now, some are excluded: those that are undocumented, those that are legal residents but not citizens. I mean, there's not everyone can vote. In many states, actually in the United States, if you have a felony conviction, you can't vote also. So there are people that are excluded from this. But often we're surprised that those we expect not to show up and vote, or to show up in lower numbers, actually come out in much higher numbers than expected, despite all the odds. And there's a certain resilience in democracy. And we often see this with immigrant voters, by the way, people who are naturalized citizens, for whom democracy is precious, for whom, becoming an American, really matters, right? So I think anything can happen in this election. I think, the turnout matters. Who shows up to vote will decide this election, probably. And we don't know who's going to turn out. And it may vary a little bit from place to place as well. Context matters a lot also. But I wouldn't be surprised if the inequalities in American society play out at the voting booth. And that would be natural. But I also wouldn't be surprised if the inequalities in American society are overcome to at least a partial extent at the voting booth, and people turn out because they see this as an election of consequence, an election for, if you live on the border, it matters for the future of the border. If you live, if you're concerned about, government support during a time of crisis, this election matters. If you're concerned about how healthcare is handled, this election matters, without saying which side you vote on, because I think people are, in this country will choose which side, but I think people realize that there are two very stark different visions at play here. One which is presented very starkly as a very particular vision of the Trump side. I think the Biden side is a less clear sort of vision, but it's clearly a different way of looking at the world entirely, right? And managing the state and managing politics entirely. So there are two very clear different ideas about where this country could head in the next 4 years. And yes, probably what we're going to see is that voting reflects America's inequalities, but there is also a good chance that that's not the case, that in fact those who have the most to gain or lose from what happens by government decisions in the next 4 years surprise us by turning out in larger numbers and voting whether their conscience says.
Thank you so much. This reflection on inequalities is, quite important. Christine.
Yeah, I wish I had a forecast about what things will look like with the elections this year. I think speaking specifically of the presidential elections, I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm hoping that lots of people will show up to vote, and that we do see a shift occur for the betterment of the country. But I will not be surprised if Trump is reelected. It seems like there is so much working against him right now in terms of reelection. But I do recall that when George W. Bush was reelected, lots of people being surprised at that time because there seemed to be a lot working against him during his second run. And I remember thinking and explaining to someone why he was reelected, thinking, well, people don't like to be wrong. So even when there has been a lot of demonstration that the promises that Trump made initially in his campaign have not panned out, and that there have been failures in leadership, this somehow has still bolstered his base of support. So it's hard to say for me. I'm hoping that there has been a shift in thinking. I'm obviously hoping that Trump is not reelected, but I think it's hard to predict. I think as my sense right now is that probably the only thing that would result in him not being reelected is among his base of supporters, that development of a sense of complacency, that maybe, well, yes, I still support him, but I don't know what, does it really matter too much anymore? And then of course, that we have a lot of other voters who didn't vote the last time around, actually go to the polls. And so I'm optimistic that will happen, but I won't be surprised if we see Trump be reelected to office.
Thank you so much. I think this, in a sense, real quick, it kind of reminds me of 4 years ago, also how everybody was in terms of, no, there's really no way, that Trump will get to the White House, and, how things ended up, turning out. Gaspar.
I want to be an optimist as well, as Christina, and I'm hoping, because of what I see is a shift in how we talk about inequalities, vulnerabilities. And I see a shift in terms of looking at a structural racism, trying to understand that, the structural inequalities, and even at the grassroots level, but also, organizations, city officials in LA, they're engaged in what does it mean in understanding structural racism. And that gives me hope, because I think those are the kinds of conversations that have been fostered by the current crisis. We need to really develop a longer term response to to what we see in the pandemic, and what Andrew was pointed out. Not everybody experiences crisis, economic, the pandemic, racism in the same way. But how we address those long-term issues are very important. So for example, the Black Lives Matter movement put on the issue, not only the issue of racism, but the issue of a structural inequality, a structural racism that is historical. How are we going to address that? One election will not end that debate. And I think we should, that issue is going to stay with us. And I think we're trying to figure out ways in which we as a society, not only through government policies, but as a society change our political consciousness, our understanding of this issue, so we can move forward. I see a dramatic shift, and that's, I think, the contribution of the mobilization, Black Lives Matter, the way we talk about race, racism, the way we talk about potential ways in which we can address that is profound. I mean, it is really you see the seeds of developing really racial consciousness that is profound. And I think we're living through that. I mean, it's difficult to see how this is playing out, but I just feel the debate being shifted to these longer terms understanding. And I think that's where we need to move at. Like there are shorter term issues about politics and elections, and then there are longer term issues societal wide. And I'm hoping that we'll move into that direction.
Thank you so much, Gaspar, for your remarks. And I do believe that we are, in fact, going through a moment, of analysis, or, I guess in many sense, self, just introspection on how we think and how we think about race and racism and the way in which it is reproduced in our country. So thank you so much to all of our, speakers for joining us today. It was a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate you getting up so early, to join us. So once again, thank you for your time. And we would like to invite everyone else who is watching to join us here, Kira, and also Giovanni, who helped us put all of this together. We wouldn't be here without our staff here at the MPC. They are reminding us that there is another, the next MPC webinar on October 21st on development, aid, and migration. And you can sign up through our newsletter, and we'll be in touch, pretty soon with links on how to sign up for that next event. So on that note, once again, thank you so much to everybody who joined, and we look forward to the next time when we can be together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
No,